Okay, so for this investigation, we're going to be talking about soil and how rocks get glued together. So we're looking at basin, sedimentation, compaction, ecosystems, matrix, soil, precipitate, and sedimentary rocks for our vocabulary words. We did a lab, and in that lab, it was a seawater investigation, so we investigated how limestone was created, and we needed large bodies of water, and we kind of then added some chemicals, some calcium hydroxide to that, and then we added some carbon dioxide to replicate respiration and animals living in that. And when we get these chemicals mixed together, it gives us a key ingredient for making limestone, which would be our calcite, or calcium carbonate. For the lab, we poured some water in, we blew some bubbles in it, and we took some observations before blowing bubbles in there, right after blowing bubbles, and after it sits. And then the next day when we came back, we noticed that there was a white precipitate at the bottom, and after letting it dry overnight, it was this harder white powder that had evaporated out and dried in the bottom of the cup, or the water evaporated out and then the powder was left behind in the cup. So we can kind of see, what happened at each stage of this, and a couple of the questions that went along with this lab. So we have, the purpose of the control cup. We can kind of use that as a comparison, a way to see what the difference was between adding carbon dioxide and respiration to the cup and not. Okay, and when we then did the acid test on that precipitate, because we are checking to see if it is like a limestone, which does react with the acid. It did fizz, so it does have calcium carbonate in it. We also tested some seashells, some seaweed, some leaves, some wood, and we really just kind of tried to narrow down these things that we would find in large bodies of water to see what reacted and what didn't react with the acid. And we see that it was the seashells and the precipitate that were the main things that reacted to the acids. As we were going through that lab, we had the water, and it kind of just giving us the little chemical breakdown of the different substances we were working with for the lab. So the calcium hydroxide, carbon dioxide, calcium carbonate. Okay, we mixed them together. We added some breath to it by blowing bubbles into it, some CO2. We get a chemical reaction that takes place. Okay, so when the calcium hydroxide comes in contact with the carbon dioxide, this chemical reaction takes place, and it produces calcium carbonate and a little bit of water. And we can kind of see here from the way this chemical formula is set up, all of the individual atoms here that we started with and ions are the same on the other side as well. So we start off with 2 oxygens, we end up with, 4 oxygens, and we end up with 4 oxygens on the other side. 1 calcium, 1 calcium, 1 carbon, 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, 2 hydrogens. So everything gets balanced out on the other side. And we have, kind of the explanation of what happened, and the main thing here is that the calcium carbonate molecule does not dissolve in water, so it stays as a solid, and that's why it sinks to the bottom, and it gets then mixed in with the rock layer at the bottom of that large body of water, which is going to turn into limestone. And we kind of take a look at how these things happen, focusing on the sedimentary rocks. We can kind of see that white precipitate sinking to the bottom. We're going to get marine life. Okay, so that's fish and other animals that are going to be living in large bodies of water that we would get fossils of, and we can kind of see how that builds up and then would eventually get into a rock layer. We also talked about some of the other types of rocks, sandstone. Okay, and when we look at sandstone, we're looking at desert and beach areas, and we're kind of taking note that we're going to glue together those sand particles with a matrix. And as we're going to glue together those sand particles with a matrix, we're looking at the sand that's kind of loose, and then after it kind of gets packed down lower under the earth, it kind of closes up a lot of those gaps and pushes them closer together, and then we get something like a matrix, or in our class we used a sodium silicate, to glue those rocks or sand and sediment together to then eventually turn it into a rock where there are very little gaps in here and they're kind of glued together. And I pointed out in class, and we'll keep reiterating, when we looked at the pieces of sandstone under a magnifying glass, we can tell that it just looks like pieces of sand pressed together, because that's what sandstone literally is, pieces of sand pressed together. And the last type of rock that we looked at in the sedimentary group is shale. Shale is going to form in swamp, wetland, forest areas. We're going to have a lot of plant life. Shale is like a mudstone. Mud packs up over time, and the water gets squeezed out, and it dries out and hardens into a rock. So that's how we look at shale, as a essentially dried out mud. Then we moved on and we started to look over our notes on the topic. So we had some notes on sand. So as we're going through from sand to soil, we started off with our definition of what soil is, and this goes back to our vocabulary definition of the soil being the upper layer of the Earth's crust where plants grow, a black or dark brown material typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, and rock particles, weathered rock material. We're looking at two main types of soil. We have residual soil that is going to come from the rock in that area, and then we have transported soil, which is going to come from other parts of the earth and get picked up by wind or water and then deposited in that area. And both of these soils are going to mix with organic materials, and they're going to have weathered rock as well. Mixing with them. Looking at the different parts of the soil, scientists study soil by digging into the ground until they reach the parent material, and they get the soil profile. Soil, if they're mature and have been in an area for quite a while, they'll then kind of start to layer or form different zones that we call horizons. And we look at a picture like this, it's very easy to see the three different layers here. So you have your top A horizon, we have our second layer here, the B horizon, and we have our third layer here, the C horizon. So kind of just looking at these different layers, we have the A horizon, which is the topsoil, and that's what we need for plants to grow. That's where the nutrients are in the soil that the plants need to take with their roots. That's why it's also darker, mixing with the organic material to give nutrients for plants and trees and shrubs to grow in that material. In the second layer, we're definitely a lot less nutrients. Some dissolved minerals will get down into that layer, but it's a lot more of a barren area where there's not as many nutrients for plants to grow in. That's why it's important that we have that topsoil with the organic material. And then we get down to our C horizon, where we're getting slightly weathered material and rock fragments, and that's getting the further down, and that's our last layer. We kind of look at the soil composition. Okay, we look at soil containing sand, silt, and clay, and the amounts of these determine the soil's ability to hold air and water. So if we look at a soil with more sand, it's going to be able to drain water a little bit easier, and water is going to be able to kind of percolate down through that or soak through. Where if it's got more silt and clay, the water is not going to be able to kind of soak down into the ground. It's going to pool up at the surface a little bit more, and it's going to take a lot longer to soak into the ground. So depending on that mixture of sand, silt, and clay, that can really make a big factor on how well an area can handle flash flooding or heavy rainstorms, and that kind of makes a big difference for what you want to do in that area. Also for planting things, makes a big difference in agriculture. Okay, soil compositions. The following are things that can affect the composition of soils. Over time, soil gets robbed of its nutrients from plants growing in it and not replenishing those nutrients. Parent material, that's the rock that the soil is made from, Different rocks are going to have different mineral makeup, and that could also affect the type of soil in an area. Plants and animals, we can cycle the type of plants that we grow. Farmers do this so that some plants will take out certain nutrients and put other nutrients back in. The next year cycle a plant that uses those extra nutrients put back in from the previous year, and kind of that way they don't ruin the soil and the nutrient content in that soil. Animals as well add to the nutritional content of soil, manure and different minerals like that as well. The topography of an area, if it's too hilly or rocky or cliff-like, it's not good for growing, and we look at then erosion and mudslides and other ways to get that soil out of there. Water flows, if we look at flooding or erosional methods, again, that could have a big effect on the area. And climate, if it's too wet or too dry, that could affect the growing or the type of plants that can grow in that soil and the condition of that soil. And while we were talking about soil, we also looked at a Newsella article, and we started to look into a little bit of the issue with GMOs, and spent a little time reading through an article and talking about some of the good things and bad things with GMOs as well, while we were on the topic of soil and a little bit of agriculture. Then we went back and finished off this section and kind of touched back upon the idea of fossils and interpreting what type of environment rock layers were created in. So we looked at a little activity in the classroom here where we had to identify what type of environment the rock layers formed in. So we could see like the K-Bob formation, which is mostly limestone. That's going to be in a marine environment. Same thing with the Torwik formation. Sandstone is going to be in a desert area. Shale is going to be forming in a floodplain and swampy forest area. Sapai group, again, probably in a limestone or a marine environment because it's a little bit of a limestone sandstone. So maybe even coastal beach, depending on what parts we're looking at. With limestone, we're looking at a marine environment, and again, we see with limestone, marine. Shale again would be swamps and floodplains, and sandstone is going to be beach areas. So that was what we kind of looked at there. And as we're talking about these different rock layers, one of the last things that we looked at was this principle of superposition, where we look at how do we know where some of the older and younger rock layers are and the way they're piled up. And it's not a very difficult concept. Okay, we look at the first layer deposited is the one at the bottom, and that's going to be the oldest layer. And the layers above the first layer are going to be younger as you go up. And I always use the example of the laundry piling up in your bedroom or in your hamper. The older laundry that you wore a couple days ago is going to be at the bottom, and as each day goes by, you're going to then put the clothes you're wearing on top of that. So the oldest clothes are at the bottom of the hamper or at the bottom of the floor of your room, and you're piling up the laundry as the days go by on top of that, and you're getting each day a new set or the youngest set of clothes on top of that pile. And same thing with the rocks, older rocks down the bottom, youngest rocks at the top. And that's pretty much it. This is a pretty short section. If you have any other questions, feel free to stop by and ask in class.